guess who I am? You're right. I'm Kristal Hart, and this is the Kristal Hart Show. We're here with Austin Pendleton, and if you go online, you can get the highlights of his prolific and varied career. Since making his Broadway debut in the original Fiddler on the Roof, he has had principal roles in over 30 movies, many TV shows, and countless stage productions. He won an Obie for The Last Sweet Days of Isaac, did Uncle Vanya with Steppenwolf Company and Shakespeare off-Broadway, and appeared in Doubles and The Diary of Anne Frank on Broadway. In movies, he was a condemned man in the 1974 remake of The Front Page, was the stuttering lawyer in My Cousin Vinny, a math professor in A Beautiful Mind, and a fish in Finding Nemo. He is also a playwright and a director. Beyond that, Austin lends his creative talents to such worthy causes as the H.B. Playwrights Foundation, where he starred in Bruce Robinson's play Another Vermeer, which will be the focus of this show. Set in post-war Holland, the play deals with a painter who is accused by the Ally High Command of having sold a Vermeer to Nazi Reich Hermann Goering. If convicted, he will be executed. Austin, nice to have you here. Austin, could you tell us what the HB Playwrights Foundation is and how you got involved in the project?
Okay, the H.B. Playwrights Foundation is connected with an acting studio right next door, the H.B. Studio, where I studied when I was first in New York with both Uta Hagen and Herbert Berghoff, who were the co-founders of it, essentially. Herbert was the original founder, and then Uta was very much involved with it, his wife. Uta, of course, is one of the great actresses of the 20th century, by pretty common consent. And she's written 2 books on acting, Respect for Acting, and most recently, A Challenge for the Actor is the more recent. So I studied with her and with Herbert, who was himself a great actor and director. It was quite a group of people here. And then Herbert, in the mid-'60s, he decided to open a theater in the place right next to HB Studio, which is what HB Playwrights Foundation is. And it's a little theater. It's a beautiful theater space. And it's entirely for the development of new work, primarily American work. And it's all about it's all about a new play being able to be produced and be seen with as good actors as possible in an environment that doesn't have anything to do with commercialism. The productions are not reviewed. The admittance is free. There's no commercial pressure on it at all. So all the decisions that are made in the development of the play are just supposed to be what's good for that play and for what the playwright wants, and not, well, if we put this in, it'll add to the commercial appeal. If we take that away, it'll add to the commercial appeal. Just being completely free of all of that. And it's been kept, and then Herbert's been gone. Yeah, he died in 1990. But it's been kept, those principles have been kept aloft ever since. And about 8 or 9, 10 years ago, the artistic directorship of it was taken over by William Carden, who's an actor and a director. He's really one of the best directors I have ever worked with. This is the first time I've worked with him, was on Another Vermeer. And early on, now, despite the policy that it's got to be free of any commercial pressure in the past, certain productions have been so well received and so fully realized artistically that they've been moved to successful commercial runs, including 2 that this man directed with Uta Hagen in the mid-'90s. The first was Mrs. Klein, the play called Mrs. Klein, and then a revival of a play by Donald Margulies, Collected Stories. And those were Uta, and each of those was some of the best acting she ever did, which is saying a lot. She was in the original production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, you know, and was one of the first people ever to play Streetcar Named Desire, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so in the early years, when Herbert had first opened the theater, I was involved in productions Herbert directed, and I even was asked by Herbert to direct a production. It was one of the first shows I ever did direct, a play by Joanna Glass. And it was So here we have this play, Another Vermeer, which fell into the hands of our director, William Carden, who, as I say, directed the 2 Uta Hagen productions that moved. And now he's done this. And so that's my connection with the place right now. I also teach at HB Studio.
Well, let me ask you, is Another Vermeer based in any way on actual events?
Completely. In fact, I think there isn't really anything in it that isn't true. I mean, things, as they always have to be in plays like that, are somewhat rearranged and telescoped, but they're all true. I play Hans van Meegeren, a painter in Holland in the 30s and 40s, and he started out not that big a success, and he was desperate for success. That was almost, if every character has a tragic flaw, every person has a tragic flaw, that was Hans van Meegeren's. And at first he wasn't paid a lot for his paintings, and he'd grown up in, not poverty exactly, but always having to worry about money. And he slept with a lot of women, so he often had people he had to support. And he never had enough, he never had enough money, and he also had, because of he had a dad who was sort of autocratic. He had this terrible hunger for approval, so he was almost unnaturally susceptible to the remarks of the critics, the hostile remarks of the critics, the ones that were hostile. I mean, he got some good reviews, but the hostile ones just killed him. Now, there isn't any artist in any field of art who isn't highly vulnerable to a hostile review. I've never heard of somebody who hasn't been somewhat affected by it, but he was really affected by it to the point where he wanted to take revenge on this one critic in particular, who was extremely influential. So he put aside his own talent for whatever it was, the kind of thing he had a talent for, his painting, and decided to pretend he had found a Vermeer painting that no one had ever known existed, and he would put it on the market for lots of money. But in fact, it's something he himself had painted. He taught himself to paint in the manner of Vermeer, and to how to age the canvas so it looked like it was an old canvas and would stand up to all kinds of tests. And he got from this, he earned lots of money, millions and tens of millions of dollars. And he was on top of the world all of a sudden, and everybody thought these were actual Vermeer paintings. Why, I don't know, incidentally. I've seen them. I don't know why anybody, particularly a critic of this man, the kind that Hans van Meegeren was after, would ever have mistaken one of these forgeries for an actual Vermeer, but they did. So he was rich, but at the same time he had lost his own art. And on top of it all, one of the paintings had gotten sold through channels to the Nazi, as you said, to Hermann Goering. And so at the end of the war, Hans van Meegeren was on trial for treason for having sold a national treasure, what people thought was an actual Vermeer, to the Nazis. So he was in big trouble and had to prove to them he was actually a forger, which meant he had to paint a new Vermeer in the manner of Vermeer in a way that would convince the experts. And if he didn't, he would be hanged because they wouldn't believe that the one that was sold to Hermann Goering was a forgery. So he was, and the play is about when he's under that pressure.
On one level, this is a suspense drama. We don't know until the very end whether the painter is going to live or die. But it also answers questions about the creative process. Could you tell us what's the difference between genius and mediocrity?
Well, I could go on all night, but the simplest way of putting it is that genius. This is what I most commonly hear as the definition of genius. Is the fully realized expression of a totally original impulse. An impulse is not an imitation of somebody else's, and is not just a paler version of somebody else's thought and feeling. A genius is a person, whether it's in painting or drama or science or mathematics or anything that is a totally original way of looking at the world. And one way of defining the power of a work of genius is it makes people see the world in one way or another a different way than they ever. You look at a Vermeer painting and you see things you don't see otherwise. You see, in his case, the quality of light. You see the way that it interacts with the world, the phenomenon of light. And he perceived that and gave a full artistic expression to it in a way that nobody else has before or since. And you go through the handful of great playwrights in the history of the world, all of them had a totally original vision. And I think it's that.
Talking about the critic, what is the relationship between the artist and the critic?
This play gets into that as dramatically and dynamically, and sometimes as humorously as any play that I know. I mean, the deep interdependency between a critic and an artist, and the love-hate. Yeah, the love-hate. I was going to say just the hate, but actually the love-hate. I mean, because the artist so desperately wants the approval of the critic, and for more than just financial reasons. And the critic, who doesn't want the approval of the artist necessarily, but who thrives on the fact of an artist's work, and the deep personal places that relationship can go to, this play gets into quite excitingly and powerfully, I think, in a way I've never seen.
Well, the critic in this play seems to be able to make or break reputations. Do you feel that any one journalist is ever this powerful?
Well, in the theater, the New York Times. Yeah, I mean, whoever's writing for the New York Times, and there have been some good writers on the Times. You know, the Times, in my knowledge, has never had a bad critic. You know, but one can ask. But in that, it's what finally confers that power is the fact that it's the Times. Now, in the days when there were more papers, there was at least one other paper, the Herald Tribune, when Walter Kerr was the critic there, which could have some power. But the Herald Tribune went down in the mid-'60s. And so since then, it's been the Times.
Well, let me ask you, can an artist be true to himself and still make money?
It happens. Happens now and again, you know. I mean, anything is possible in this world. It's hard. It's hard. And I think people are always, in every era that ever lived, people have been heard to make this this comment, but it gets harder and harder with every passing generation, I think. It gets more and more allied to the bottom line, and particularly in things like the theater and film. I don't know about painting.
And what do you feel this play has to say about art?
Well, it says, if you allow things to take you off your true artistic path, whatever that is, you pay for it in the most terrible ways.
The play contrasts true art with corrupt art. Yeah. Your character has become rich and famous through forgeries. He is a fraud. Yeah. But in your career, you have moved back and forth between very serious work and more commercial efforts. Do you think Say Goodnight, Gracie is less valid than Mr. and Mrs. Bridge?
No. Oh, God, no. I think that's a very, very rich play, Say Goodnight, Gracie. Now, that's not to be confused with the one-man play that was on Broadway last year, which was about George Burns. This is a play written 20 years ago, or 23 or 4 years ago by Ralph Pape, which is still produced sometimes. And that play, it's a comedy, and it's terribly funny, but it's also very poignant and has a really edgy undercurrent. But even if it were only funny, there's no way that something that's only funny cannot be a work of art, you know. It's just how it comes out. If just so long as it comes out unfettered. People seem to think that art doesn't qualify as art unless it's really sad. And certainly things that are really sad tend to be artistic, because if they were concerned about commercial things, they wouldn't be just terribly sad, such as a picture like Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, which is, I think, of all the movies I've ever been in, it could well be my favorite. I mean, I love that movie, but it's not great because it's sad. You know what I mean? It's great because it is what it is, and I think that Say Goodnight, Gracie also is what it is. Actually, the underlying thing of Say Goodnight, Gracie, the underlying feeling of it is quite sad, but the characters all deal with that with a great deal of humor, so it has this own peculiar humor. But I think it has real. I've been in things that have been strictly commercial enterprises. I mean, don't get me wrong. and I will again, you know, but I'll do it again. But I think just a work, whether it's comedy or tragedy or tragic comedy or sad comedy, as in the case of Gracie, or a heartbreaking domestic thing like Mr. and Mrs. Bridge, or whatever it is, so long as it's true to its own intentions and its own impulses, and it's good, that's important too, it's artistic.
The Diary of Anne Frank has some broad similarities to Another Vermeer. They're both about the artistic process, both set in the 1940s, and both involve the Nazis. Do the similarities end there? Yeah,
I think so. I think so. But those are powerful similarities. There's an atmosphere that's somewhat the same because of all that. That the correctness of people who are Dutch and being enveloped by this horror, this alien horror, I mean virtually alien horror, and the different ways people are having to survive. And so there's an atmosphere that has a similarity. This play is nowhere near as dark as the Diary of Anne Frank, but few things are. I was going to say before, and actually the Diary of Anne Frank is an example of this, is that it's a thing can be enormously successful commercially and still be of genuine artistic merit. It happens. And a thing can be a resounding flop, misunderstood in its own time, and have no artistic value at all. You know, so it's a very strange. The division between art and commerce isn't that clear, you know. But there are people who corrupt what they do in order to make money, and if they do that, if they can get away with it, fine. Han von Meegeren did not get away with it.
Well, the Nazis are generally thought of as gangsters who used art strictly for plunder. Do you feel that Himmler or Goering or any of these had any appreciation for great art or sculpture for its own sake?
Well, the horror is that they did, which just further, I don't know about those two men in particular, but I mean, a lot of the top Nazis were known for their deep emotional response to classical music, which was authentic. I mean, their response was authentic. Now, what are you going to do with that? I mean, again, people are just so infinitely complicated. How you could respond to music the way some of those people did, and to art, and yet permit the atrocities to take place that they did. I mean, people are just terrifyingly complicated.
Well, this is fascinating work, highbrow, just wonderful. Is there another production in the works?
There is, I believe. I think it's going to reappear in a few months in a longer run in a different theater, I think. Okay. I mean, there have been people coming to see it who are trying to put that together because they're excited about it. You know, it's a very entertaining play. It's some of the themes of it, sometimes before people come to see it, they get a little intimidated by the themes, that it's going to be like a very difficult argument to follow, and that it's all about the ideas. There are real ideas in it, but it's essentially about the interplay among these people. And the people are all very juicy and rich, and there's a lot of humor in it, and there's a lot of just old-fashioned drama in it, and intensity, and then there's a lot of lightness, and that comes at sometimes at the most unexpected places. And it's an hour and a half long, and it's, you know, finally, I think whether a play is sad or funny or farcical or musical or whatever it is, or a play of ideas even, and this isn't completely a play of ideas at all. It has ideas in it, but it's not a play of ideas. But whatever it is, a play has to be entertaining. And by entertaining, I don't mean anything more than the audience, for the duration of the play, they want to know what's going to happen next. That's what I mean by entertaining. I mean, you can throw all the glitz at the audience in the world and all the entertainment values and production values, but if the audience doesn't care what happens next, it's all for naught. Entertainment is when you sit on the edge of your seat. Entertainment is like what you had when you were 3 years old, when somebody told you a story, you know?
Austin, before we leave HB Playwrights, could you tell us the importance of formal training to the actor?
It's total. I think there are some very talented people right now who have had most of their experience, or even all of it in some cases, in theater or the movies. I mean, in TV or movies, who are trying to do theater now. And often the attempt is admirable, and sometimes, as in the case like a few years ago with Jessica Lange, the attempt, as far as I'm concerned, is intensely successful. I mean, but somewhere along the line, if you're going to play particularly the great theater roles, there's all kinds of demands they make that aren't what film and television make. Now, it should be added that to be a really good film actor, well, and certainly Jessica Lange is an example of that, that's an exacting art in itself. I mean, people sneer and say, well, she's a movie star. Well, you try it. You try playing a really complex, demanding, emotional role under the conditions of doing a movie. The first 2 or 3 movies I was in, which was after I'd done a few years of theater, I was, as one of my first directors said, you're a total amateur at this. And it's true. It's a very demanding profession, and anybody who can be a good film actor or a consistently good actor on a sitcom on television is a real artist. It's very demanding work. It's just, all I'm saying is the demands of the theater are different. They aren't necessarily higher, but they're different. People tend to write for the theater in a different way. Long, sustained scenes, long verbal demands, long, ever-escalating emotional demands, terrific powers of concentration. You can't go over and do another take and all that kind of thing. And I think that sometimes people come into the theater in a very prominent way without being quite ready for it. Now, people have accused me of having started this trend because a little over 20 years ago, I directed the stage debut of Elizabeth Taylor on Broadway in The Little Foxes. And I was told at the time, you've started the beginning of the decline. Well, Elizabeth Taylor is very different. She had, of course, this remarkable film career, but almost all her greatest triumphs on film were in parts that were originally written for the theater, with the demands intact, like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Suddenly Last Summer. These are plays by very important American playwrights who wrote on a very high level, Tennessee Williams, Edward Albee, and so forth. And she handled it all. I mean, in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, you have a long, sustained takes of very difficult scenes, and with all their demands intact in terms of language and feeling, and you get that certainly in the film from Tennessee Williams, from Suddenly Last Summer. And so I thought, was she alone among that era of the movie stars? Actually, the part of Regina in The Little Foxes, which was her Broadway debut, her stage debut, for God's sake, was not as demanding a theatrical role as she had played in the Albee and the Williams films. So I thought that was an exception. I mean, that was, and there are exceptions today, such as, for example, Jessica Lange, who I mentioned, and others who primarily worked in film and or television, and they come to the stage. But there are and these other people are very talented, but it's like and I hope they keep at it. I hope they don't get frightened away by criticism, because they should keep at it. But the ideal thing would have been if they'd seen this coming, would have been able to do a whole lot of demanding parts in other theaters. Like, I admired when Keanu Reeves went to some obscure place in Canada. Well, no, not obscure, but some provincial place, some place in the provinces of Canada, and played Hamlet, rather than kind of announcing he was going to play Hamlet on Broadway. And I heard he was pretty good, actually. But go out there and work on these things and struggle. And because with most people who are movie stars and even some TV stars, unfortunately, this shouldn't be true, but it is. The clock is ticking in terms of leading roles. So they're going to want to get to the point where they can spend a lot of great years in the theater after the movies have kicked them out, which it happens. I just, and these people have trained. Don't get me wrong. They've trained. They've had acting classes, but those acting classes are pitched to a certain kind of writing that is done in film and television, which is often very good writing, but it's just not the same as theater writing. And these people, we could get a treasure trove of actors from these, so long as they're allowed to develop properly.
Well, I have a confession to make to our viewers. Austin and I are from the same town, Warren, Ohio. Austin.
So it's Chris Columbus.
Oh, okay. What could you tell us what your most vivid recollection of our hometown is?
Oh God. Well, the house, the street you grew up on.
Oh.
Long before you were born, I would pedal by there every morning on my bicycle on the way to school.
Oh.
Yeah, I love that town. I still love it.
Oh, yes. Well, you're from a big theater family in a certain way. Your mom did.
She was an apprentice or a journey person, as they would call it now, at the Cleveland Playhouse in the 30s, which is where my father first actually saw her. And they got married, and as people did in those days, well, it still happens, but they really did in those days, she gave all that up to settle with him as his wife in Warren, Ohio. And then she settled there in 1938. Then after World War II, a few years later, some people came to her because they were beginning a community theater group there, and they got her involved with it, both as an actress and as a director. And so when I grew up, she was acting in a lot of the plays there, and until she moved away from there many years later in the late 80s after our father died, she directed almost annually, and she acted up until like the late 60s or and she was of professional caliber, and she was very glamorous, and she was very intense in her dedication to theater, and of course all that had a big influence on me. The early rehearsals for this group were in our living room in the evenings. People would come over after dinner and rehearse a play in the living room, and I was like 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years old or something in the early years, and I just thought, this is it. The way the energy of the whole house would be transformed when they were rehearsing that play, I just thought was wonderful.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We've been here with Austin, and thank you for being on the show, and good luck with everything. Break a leg. Thank you. That's all the time we have for this show. But you can email me at kristalhart@hotmail.com. Love to hear from you.